Hello everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the question, how can we analyze the quality of instructional presentations? And this is a follow-up from our week 1 learning goal. Right, we're applying Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning, and today we're going to take a look at presentations. Now, last week we talked about Mayer's 5 principles for reducing extraneous processing and how that ties into instructional images. Remember, these principles are aimed at reducing that extraneous cognitive load, things that are distractions from the lesson. And Mayer talks about things like removing extraneous material, using cues to highlight things, removing redundant information, and just having things spaced correctly and timed correctly. Okay, so we're still going to use these ideas. We're not going to go over them again since we went over them last week, at least not in detail. We're just going to quickly remind everyone of our checklist, right? So when we're looking for extraneous processing, we're wondering, is there unnecessary text or visuals that can be removed? Are there things we can add highlighting to using signaling? Is there redundant information we can remove? And are there words that can be spaced better or timed better, essentially? Okay, so we're going to still apply these concepts today, but I do want to focus on the ones we didn't review last week, so that way we get some extra practice there. So let's take a look at some of Mayer's other principles. So next up, Mayer has 3 principles for managing essential processing. Remember, these are the principles tied to managing that intrinsic cognitive load. So this is tied to the lesson directly, the cognitive load of the content. Okay, so if we want to manage that, Mayer has 3 strategies for us. The first is the segmenting principle, where the idea is that we want to present information in user-paced segments rather than just a continuous flow of information. The pre-training principle, where we should be pre-teaching names and characteristics of main concepts, so that way students aren't finding them all out at once when they're learning them in context, right? We're giving them little breadcrumbs and little clues as to what these names and characteristics are before they truly see them in their main area. And the modality principle states that we should use pictures and spoken words over pictures and printed words, okay? So the idea here, we want to use those dual channels. So we want to be able to see the pictures and hear the words, so that way we can utilize both of our channels. Whereas if we're using pictures and printed words, those are both using our visual channel, so it's a little tougher there. Okay, so these are Mayer's 3 principles for managing essential processing. Okay, similar to his other principles, I've turned these into questions so that we can follow along with a checklist. So for segmenting, we want to look at, when we're looking at content, is information chunked into user-paced segments? Okay, if it's not, then that's something we can fix. That's something we can change. Pre-training are names and characteristics of main concepts introduced prior to the lesson. And modality are pictures and spoken words used over pictures and printed words. Okay, so these are our checklists. Next, we're going to take a look at some examples, but eventually we're going to be applying these to give each other some feedback on our presentations from last week. First, let's take a look at segmenting. Okay, with segmenting, we want to know, is that information chunked into those user-paced segments or not? So we want to take presentations that have a flow of information, right? Lots of subjects on one slide, and we want to spread that out. Okay, we want to chunk it into smaller pieces. So let's say you were doing a presentation on instructional theory. You wanted to talk about behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism. Maybe we don't talk about all of those on one slide, right? Maybe instead we split that up into 3 slides and we just talk about behaviorism on the first slide. Okay, so this is what chunking is. We're taking things that would normally overload our user, that's giving them too much information at once, and we want to take it and give them an appropriate amount of information instead. Next up, pre-training. There's a lot of different ways to utilize pre-training. I've seen pre-training done in warm-ups in the classroom. I've seen people utilize word walls where students can just look and see concepts on the wall so that the way they're getting familiar with them prior to the lesson starting. And you can also introduce content as you go and just make sure you're introducing it beforehand, before students are getting that kind of main chunk of information. Right? Let's say in our lesson on instructional theory, we bring up behaviorism. Well, that's great if later in the lesson we're going to refer to behaviorism. Okay, so if you wanted to teach your students about John Watson, the father of behaviorism, it might help to talk about what behaviorism is before you talk about Watson. And then when we do talk about Watson, it'll make more sense to the learner. They'll be able to tie or make that connection between Watson and behaviorism and what the definition of behaviorism is. So we have more kind of strands to draw those connections from. But this is the idea of pre-training, where we shouldn't be surprised by terms and main concepts as they come up, right? We should try to flesh those out prior to the lesson or prior to them coming up in the lesson at least. So that way students aren't trying to figure out, well, what's behaviorism? Who's John Watson? Why is this experiment relevant? Right? They at least have a foundation to start from instead of trying to figure it all out at once. So you can see how this really helps with the cognitive load, where I don't have to deal with that cognitive load of behaviorism on this slide because we've already talked about it. So we've already helped reduce that. Maybe not eliminated, but at least reduced it. So that's the idea with pre-training. And then finally, on this little sublist, we have the modality principle, which says we want to use spoken words over printed words, right? We want to take advantage of those dual channels. People can hear, usually, so we want to take advantage of that pathway when possible, right? So instead of giving someone a picture and a bunch of text and then talking about the text as your students are reading it, right? We know how confusing that can be when you're reading and listening to text at the same time. Instead, maybe just consider, just have the picture, have the title, and talk about that content instead. Okay, this is probably the number one biggest thing I think that I see as a student that my professors are doing wrong, or my peers were doing wrong as a student or as a high school teacher. Right? We love putting this big blocks of information in these PowerPoints, and then we talk about them at the same time students are reading them, and it just confuses everyone. So if you're going to stick to one principle on this whole list, I would say this is the one, right? Get rid of that extra text, use your voice instead, use that spoken word, so that way students can look at the picture but still hear what you're saying, and I think they'll learn a whole lot more if we follow this modality principle. Okay, in Mayer's third list, he has 4 principles for fostering generative processing. Remember, this is tied to that germane cognitive load, right? These are the tips to help us build connections between our educational contents. So what are the principles? The first one, the multimedia principle, states we should use words and images over words on their own. Okay, images add to our context, so we want to utilize those. The personalization principle, which states to speak in a conversational style. The voice principle, which states that we should use a human voice over a machine voice when possible. And the image principle, which states that we should prioritize relevant images over just displaying the speaker speaking. Okay. Now, let's take a look at what these might look like in a checklist form. Since we're going to be viewing others' presentations, we want to be able to just follow a quick checklist. And for multimedia, we're curious, are images used alongside words? Right? If they're not, how can we add them? Personalization, is the speaker speaking in a conversational style? Okay, are we using really big words? Are we using lots of educational jargon, lots of acronyms, right? The more of that you're using, the harder it is for your learner to understand what's going on and make those connections. Voice, is a human voice used? Is a robotic AI voice used that's going to distract our learner? And finally, image-wise, are relevant images displayed rather than just displaying the speaker? Okay, so this is our last part of our checklist that we're going to be looking at as we're giving feedback on these presentations. My hope is that this will be good practice if you guys ever enter the world of instructional design, right? You're going to be meeting with professors. They're going to show you their presentation, and you're going to want to be able to give feedback. And if we give feedback based on Mayer's advice, then at least we have kind of that research-based foundation, that best practices foundation that we can kind of point to. And yes, I'd like you to change this, but here is why. Because using images alongside words is going to help improve your content, according to Mayer, right? So that's the idea here. So let's take a look at some of these examples. First up, our multimedia example. Are images used alongside words or not? Okay, obviously this is just saying if we have a slide with some basic information on it, if we can add an image, we can add more context, more details, right? We can give the learner something to look at to break up the monotony of the slide. It just helps with learning. So add in images when possible. If anything, I'd say these slides have a little too much text, right? And probably not enough images. So multimedia principle, we're adding in those images. The personalization principle, is the speaker speaking in a conversational style or not? If you're using these big giant words that your students might not understand, right? Juxtaposition, loquacious, superfluous, I can't quite pronounce that one even. Right? Get rid of those words. We want to speak in as simple a manner as possible to cover the topic. So that way we can convey our point as efficiently as possible, right? So that's speaking conversationally. That's speaking in a way that your learner is comfortable with, because whatever your learner is comfortable with, that's the medium we need to reach them through, right? Whatever their vocabulary is, that is the toolbox we can use to reach them. So we want to speak in that conversational style. We want to speak in a way that our learner can understand us, is the biggest thing. Okay, as far as the voice principle, this is a pretty simple one. Is a human voice used or not? Okay, if they're using some AI, some new AI trend or some robot, and it's really obvious this is a robotic voice, not a human voice, right? Maybe throw that out, because that might become distracting. I think as AI gets better, as voiceovers get better, this principle might go away. Okay, in 5-10 years, I don't know if we'll be able to tell the difference between an AI narrator and a human narrator. But at least for now, if it's really obvious that AI narration is occurring and it does not sound like a human, maybe do a natural voiceover instead. Or consider switching voices to pick one that sounds more human if you are going to stick with that voiceover option. Then finally, the image principle pretty much states that we want to use relevant images. We want to use images that add to the context of the learning taking place. Okay. A picture of someone talking and not presenting information. Okay, this gentleman at least has a graph behind him that he's talking about. But the idea that we're just going to show a picture of their talking head and just the talking head doesn't quite help, right? We'd much rather have a relevant image displayed. Okay, here, if you're giving a talk on the brain, maybe we're going to show a picture of the brain or a graphic that illustrates our point about maybe the different nodes of the brain, right? And the connections that are being made and that sort of thing. So maybe we want to show instead an instructional image that helps add to the conversation, add context. And then what I like to do is just put yourself in the corner if you want to add that personal element of a person speaking. Okay, we don't have to have them displayed full screen, just look at me, right? Instead, put your speaker off in the corner or off screen entirely and really focus on the relevant images, right? What context are we adding to the lesson? That's number one with our images. Displaying the speaker is nice, but it's not as good as showing relevant images that add context to our content. So you should always prioritize that. Okay, so that's all the content I have for you guys today. Just a review of Mayer's principles, which hopefully you're getting a pretty good grasp of by now. As far as remaining tasks for you to work on today, there is no required reading since we're still working off Mayer's principles. If they're still a little confusing to you, there are some options to extend your learning. Okay, there's an article and a video talking about Mayer's principles, but we've done a couple classes on this. You guys are probably pretty comfortable. I'm hoping, at least at this point. But if you want to check those out, those are there for you. Since we've already done this content before, there is no quiz this week. Okay, we just want to apply these principles in our assignment, which is going to be discussion 7. So in discussion 7, we're essentially going to take a look at the video presentations you guys made last week. You're going to post a link to that. Your peers are going to check it out, and we're going to give feedback based on Mayer's principles. Okay, so the idea here is that we're trying to simulate this instructional design rule where maybe you're not the subject matter expert, but you're looking at someone else's material that is a subject matter expert. And how can we advise them in a way that's constructive and respectful, but still research-based, right? So we want to tie everything back to Mayer's principles because we know those are backed by the research, and those are some of the best practices we want to be implementing as instructional designers. So that's the idea there with discussion 7. I'm going to cut now, and we're going to take a look at the actual discussion. Okay, so here is what discussion 7 looks like. We are submitting our video of our annotated presentation from last week. Then we're going to give each other some feedback, right? This is in all of our projects in this class, we're going to try to follow that ADDIE model. So the E is evaluate, to evaluate our project, see if we did a good job developing our materials. We need some feedback. So this is the idea, is that these discussions are your evaluation phase. They are your feedback, right? So we'd like to get some feedback so that way we can improve things going forward. Just remember, when giving each other feedback, always try to keep it respectful, try to keep it constructive. Tell them either how people can improve their presentation, or if they did a good job, I want to know how their presentation does a good job, okay? Try to give me some context here. What did they do a good job of? And then I give you guys Mayer's checklist here. Okay, so you can check this checklist as you're going with Mayer's 13 principles, and they're spaced out based on those sections. Okay, so check out someone's video, run through that checklist, think about, is there anything that you can tell them to improve on? Or is there anything that stand out like, man, they really did a good job with the segmenting principle. Everything is perfectly chunked into those user pay segments, like fantastic, right? If they do a great job, tell them. But yeah, this is what we're working on today. Grading wise, you get 2 points for submitting your video and then 4 points for writing to your peers this week. Trying to think if there's anything else you guys need to know. I think that's it. So go ahead and try this out. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions. And then try to get those presentations submitted as well. I know some of us are wrapping those up today. If anything pops up on those, if you're having issues with YouTube, right, feel free to shoot me an email, but try to get those submitted by tonight. So that way you can submit your video into discussion 7 by Friday. And then like always, this post will be due next Monday. Okay, so go ahead, get to work. Let me know if you guys have any questions at all, and have a wonderful day.